Welcome to the Science to People podcast, where we turn cutting-edge health and science insights into information that's discoverable, understandable, and actionable. I'm your host, Brinley Murphy-Reuter. Now, today's episode is about something deceptively simple: how children think. Our guest is Dr. Elizabeth Bonawitz, a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education who studies how kids build knowledge through curiosity, exploration, and their own mental models. In her recent article in Psychology Today, Dr. Bonawitz makes the case that kids aren't blank slates or empty vessels for us parents just to fill them with knowledge or teach them curiosity. They're already theory builders, constantly trying to make sense of the world, even when adults don't notice it. So, as a parent of two young kids, I'm wondering, how can we better support that kind of thinking? And why does it matter more than ever? Dr. Bonawitz, welcome to the Science to People podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here chatting with you today.
Yes, it's so nice to see you again. I last reached out to you as a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and you are there doing incredibly important work, especially relevant to myself as a parent of two young kids. So I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Excited to chat.
Great. So normally we start this podcast with a very simple kind of coffee shop line question. If you're standing in line for a coffee shop, it's long, we're bored, I turn around and say, hey, tell me about yourself. How would you describe your work?
So I'm the Associate Professor of Learning Sciences at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. There's a lot of different ways of defining learning sciences. So basically from my definition, that means I study how children learn. I try to understand what are the factors that help children revise their beliefs, form an understanding of how the world works, starting from infancy through early childhood, all the way up through adulthood. So I'm trying to understand the sort of basic cognitive mechanisms, the way our mind processes information that allow us to get to be so smart.
And all of this starts from very young children that you're looking at. Is that right?
That's right. I've got studies with infants, but we have studies with 2 and 3-year-olds, studies with preschoolers, kindergartners, early elementary, and I also study how adults think and reason about the world. So really, we want to understand what we'd call universal mechanisms that support learning, what do we think is in place for all humans throughout the lifespan.
And is this traditional learning or learning to exist in the world when you talk about learning, or both?
That's a great question. So what we're studying in my lab is how children form abstract causal representations of the world. So let me unpack that, because that's a lot of big words.
Yeah. You're going to have to take a step back and let's do that one.
So what we're interested in is the idea that as human beings, we have sort of our own intuitive theories about how the world works. We think science is possible because we were once children. That means that we can form early from infancy and all the way up some coherent rules or guidelines for understanding and explaining the world. So for example, we can reason about other people's beliefs. So we have intuitions about the ideas that people have goals and desires and that they act according to those goals and desires. We've got intuitive theories about biological kinds, such as growth and illness and how those things work. We've got intuitive theories about the physical domain. So how forces act on objects, when an object should fall, what kinds of things objects can't pass through other objects. So constantly, the way that we make sense of the world, the way that we understand and explain the world around us is by forming what are these intuitive theories, or we've got little scientific theories going on in our own heads, and that allows us to organize and explain the world. So we call those, they're abstract, they're not necessarily grounded out in specific examples, but we've got general principles that they apply to. They're causal, so they make predictions about if this happens, then something else should happen. And they're coherent, which means they hold up across multiple different kinds of contexts. So I study how we get that kind of rich, kind of theory-like knowledge in our head.
Oh, so some of it you're saying intuitive. So that means it shows up at minute 1 in the world. We'll probably be able to see it at minute 1, but then it also develops and strengthens like a muscle with use over time, or with reinforcement over time?
Yeah, so these are questions that are actually starting to get at the heart and the core of being a developmental psychologist. So what is the nature of our knowledge when we are born? What are the kinds of constraints that guide our learning over development? So there are different theories around what that knowledge already looks like, but I think that many of us at Harvard tend to hold an intuitive idea that children children actually have knowledge that's already relatively conceptual at birth. So there's knowledge that is not just perceptual. We're not just getting it from the outside world, but we have beliefs about, for example, objects, not being able to pass through other objects. That's a kind of concept that we have. But that knowledge absolutely gets richer and more elaborate throughout development. And we also have intuitions that get overturned because what we can observe in the world is not actually true to how science works. So for example, we have a hard time understanding germs because germs are invisible. They don't always act consistently. So they're not deterministic. You might get exposed to germ and sometimes get sick and sometimes not get sick. They also operate over long time periods. So it's not an instantaneous response. So a lot of things that we are perceiving in the world sometimes conflict with our actual rich knowledge that we have to make jive with how science actually works. So germs, reasoning about germs, illness, physical systems, there's lots of things, living things, the idea that a tree, which doesn't move and looks like it's just stationary and why is it growing, right? That doesn't feel like a living thing to many kids. Whereas the sun moves across the sky, that's something the kids might think is living. So there's all these things that we're getting from our experience in early childhood that does have to get revised. But yes, we've got lots of mechanisms that help us learn about the world that are there from birth, but that is definitely a process of enrichment, elaboration, and revision. So it gets stronger and it gets more detailed and it also changes over time.
And something popped into my head as I was thinking about this tree, right? This idea that a tree is a living thing. We talk about this a lot with my kids, like, be gentle with that, or, you don't just rip the leaves off of the neighbor's plants for various different reasons.
One finger touch. That's
that's nice. One finger touch. I'm just like, stop. Yours is more gentle. Do you think that the kind of the character version of inanimate objects being animated is helpful for kids or confusing for this developmental process of learning that things live or don't? Like, I'm thinking about, Blue's Clues, like there's salt and shakers with faces on them and all, then another thing, the trees all have faces and talk. Is that useful? And is it only useful if they're actual things that could be alive? Like salt shaker, not useful, tree with a face useful?
So I think taking stories and making them, making a tree animate. So making it like an agent that can act or talk or think in the world. I think kids are actually quite good at recognizing that is made up, that's a story, because they can see that trees aren't going to talk or think. A salt shaker doesn't suddenly get up and move around on the table, whatever it may be. That might actually undermine the other information that you might want to teach about that tree. Because as soon as you put this flag on a book or a story that says, wait, what you're telling me here is pretty fanciful, this can't really be true, maybe something else you tell me about that might not also be true. So if you tell kids ahead of time, well, we're just telling a story about these germs that can't really talk, but the other stuff that we're going to tell you is real, they might be able to start separating that out, especially by 3 or 4, where they're starting to understand testimony and truth.
And so obviously, like, I'm asking this as a parent, and I think about a lot of people who are going online looking for parenting advice or early childhood development, whether they're asking Siri, asking friends, Googling something, now using generative AI. They often find kind of checklists. There's like developmental milestones. There's, should you be crawling? Should you be doing this? Should you be doing that? Attention spans, tantrums, whatever. But your work is really inviting us to look more deeply at how kids are actually thinking about the world around them and how we can support that. Where do you hope that your research shows up for people in these kinds of searches?
That's a great question. So, the core questions that I'm really engaged with are, what are the mechanisms that best support that learning? What is it about the human mind that best helps children learn? And so, I study 3 general domains that we look at. One is the idea that our knowledge is rich and structured, that we use our own prior beliefs or top-down cognition in the process of learning. A second is the idea that we are learning from other people and we're sensitive to cues for teaching. So for example, if a teacher that I trust, that is knowledgeable, gives me some information and says, oh, it's the case that air actually is made up of stuff. And I compare that to a case where someone who's giving me information might not be knowledgeable or is not engaged in teaching, but is asking a question because they don't know the answer. Then I interpret that data differently. So understanding how children bring expectations about others and how that changes the way they interpret evidence. And then the third piece that I look at is the idea that we are sensitive to our own uncertainty. We know when we don't know something, right? And it's actually a great motivator. So children are surprised, they are confused, they have all sorts of instances in which there's some information that's given that they're like, wait a minute. And one thing that you can do when you're surprised or confused about something, when you have uncertainty, is be curious. It can motivate you to want to find out the answer, to try to resolve that. And so a big piece of my recent work has been trying to understand this idea of curiosity. What is curiosity? Where does it come from? And most importantly, what are the things that we can do to promote it? I actually think very, very strongly that the one thing we can count on, what's the quote? The one thing we can count on is change, right? So
right.
we don't
I said that a lot with a new baby, with both new babies. I said that a lot. Like, once you think something is the way it is, it's no longer that way.
Exactly. So we don't know what the jobs are going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years. And we need a workforce in this country and around the world that is flexible, that's adaptable. You need a workforce that's recognizing when they don't know something, that is motivated to try to resolve that uncertainty, and that knows how to take the steps to go about getting the answers or getting the solutions. And so where I hope my research shows up is in helping parents and educators think about how can we harness and how can we foster or continue to support the kinds of core abilities that are already in place from early infancy that support that. How do we foster curiosity? How do we foster this ability to learn how to learn, our ability to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and our sort of intellectual humility, our desire to want to resolve that and to get to truth as best we can so we can make the most informed decisions that we can. And so hopefully my research shows up in teacher trainings or in pediatricians' offices or in conversations among parents at the park when they're thinking about, my son or daughter or my child is really struggling with this concept. I wonder what I could do. And having another parent be saying, I actually read this cool article that says one of the things you can do is ask questions. I'm hoping my work shows up in all those domains.
I really love this concept of asking questions. And I think I read somewhere a while ago that kids that are more curious or ask more questions do have better grades or maybe make more money or something. And of course, it's probably clickbait. But it really got me thinking about how I respond to the questions that my kids are asking, and then how I interact with them to encourage more question asking. And it's a complicated relationship as a parent between, stop asking questions, I'm just trying to make dinner, and trying to really shepherd them in this experiential learning. But it's interesting that curiosity is so vitally important for the future or you're saying that it is. And I think I would really agree. Our first guest, Dr. Matt Mata, at the end, I asked him, if he could wish one thing for 1 million people, what would it be? And he said curiosity. He said the curiosity was his number one wish for people. And I was really surprised by that. But it sounds like this is something that's so vitally important to who we are as we age. And now in this kind of world of who knows what jobs we'll be doing, seems like it's a really important skill to build. Would you even call it a skill?
I mean, it's a good question whether we'd call it a skill or whether we'd call it a mechanism. So yeah, there's a lot you said there. Let me try to unpack some. So first of all, agree. Thank you. I wonder if this study you're thinking about was work by Shaw and colleagues that came out that showed a relationship between children's curiosity and their academic outcomes in school. And for example, they found a very strong correlation between performance there, but especially for children from lower socioeconomic status, from lower resourced backgrounds. For those children, really having curiosity is something that was a great equalizer. It was the thing that helped those students have higher math and verbal scores on tests. So we know from some correlational studies that curiosity is something that looks like it's really critical for academic outcomes. In our own work, we're trying to see whether or not there are ways to prompt curiosity, to do what we'd call a intervention or an experiment where we try to bring about more interest and more engagement with topics and thus more learning. So I can talk about a couple of studies in that, but we can come back to that in just a minute. As a parent, you're talking about the balance between, all of us are so busy. We're so busy. We're cooking and driving the kids to activities, and we're working jobs, and there's a lot that's always going on. And so one of the things that I think has been a natural question or concern for parents is, am I giving enough time to my child, right? Am I giving them the sort of time that they need? And there's been a lot of work just in sort of looking at the conversations that parents and children have together, that is starting to come out that really recognizes it's not necessarily quantity, it's quality. So if you have quality time together with your child where you're sitting down and engaging with them for 15 or 20 minutes, reading a book together, asking questions as you're going through to them to get them to think, to show your own wonder and excitement, modeling that curiosity and that wonder, that's really important. It's also okay to have boundaries and to explain to your children, like, right now I'm cooking dinner and I really want to hear what you're talking about. But if I don't pay attention to what's happening here, I'm going to burn the dinner and I'm not. So why don't you finish reading and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it. Okay. And so it's absolutely fine for parents to feel the fact that they have to juggle a lot, and for children to understand those boundaries. One of the things I do worry about is that parents feel like, oh God, if I'm not constantly there attending to my child, that I'm not doing enough. Actually, it's great for them to develop independence and for them to learn to explore on their own and to have moments where their parents trust them to take risks and to try testing things out on their own. That's actually a really important confidence booster that I think is related to that one of those three pieces I talked about adaptability and curiosity, right? There's the recognizing that you don't know something. There's the desire to want to do something about it. And then there's the knowing that you can plan and execute an action to carry out some learning on your own. And so it's totally okay for you as a parent to say to your child, let's see if you can figure out for a minute on your own, and I'll come back and help you as soon as I'm done cooking and we'll talk about it. So happy to talk more about that.
I would love to hear about that, because one of my kids' preschool teachers used to have this ask three than me rule, where she encouraged them to ask three other friends before they asked the teacher for help with something. And it wasn't necessarily just like, why is the sky blue type of questions, but like, I can't tie my shoes, or I can't get my jacket zipped. So it was like, ask three friends for help. And then if you still are tapping out, then you can ask me. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think it encouraged independence or kind of help seeking, and then turning to an adult. But I would love to hear about these kind of engagement fostering studies that you're working on, and how we might be able to apply it to our own lives or parenting journeys, or even adults, I guess.
I love the ask three than me, not just because it supports independent and peer learning, which is important, but because also we learn a lot by teaching. We learn a lot by explaining. So it actually helps the other kids in the classroom practice their own skills at thinking through how something works and explaining to each other. So that's a very cute approach. In my own work, we've studied question asking from a couple of perspectives. We've looked at the perspective of when the parent is the one asking the questions. And we've also looked at the perspective of when you get children to engage in asking their own questions.
Of other children or of adults?
Of adults, although we've also studied children's question asking in preschool settings in naturalistic contexts, looking at what kinds of questions children tend to ask each other versus adults. They do tailor what we'd call learning questions more to adults. They have more communication questions and other kinds of questions they tend to direct towards other children. But in terms of encouraging children to ask their own questions, in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Alison, who's a professor at Penn, we engaged in what we called a science camp training session for preschoolers.
Fun.
This was during the height of the COVID pandemic. And so we scheduled these Zoom lessons. So they were online over the computer. And we had children enrolled in one of two conditions. So for one group of children, we read them a bunch of books about how animals engage in like camouflage and build habitats. And we also had activities with those kids. And then we also had activities, books, and sort of general storytelling lesson plans that we had for the children. And for all those children, we met with each individual child 10 times, 10 sessions, each one for a half an hour. And what we said to them was, we said to them at the beginning of the lesson, what we want you to do is try to ask as many questions as possible about these books as we're reading them or about the activities. Ask us anything you want as we go through. And if they asked a question, say, that was a really great question. I'm so glad you asked that, right? And so really encouraging them to be engaged in the content. For a different group of children, we told them, okay, well, actually during this activity to learn the most, we want you to pay really careful attention. So otherwise the content was exactly the same. Children got exactly the same content, exactly the same amount of time spent. And what we did was we looked at the end of these individual lessons and we tested over 100 children. So that's, on the order of 800, 900 sessions that we've engaged in with each
30 minutes each. That's a big commitment.
It's a big commitment, but this is what we do in science. We need to get at the causal story of how something works and whether something is impactful in a real sense. This is what we have to do to run studies, to trust our data. So what we found was that at the end of the test, what we did was we measured what children learned from the stories, and we also measured their curiosity or interest in learning more about science content. So we gave them a task called a willingness to pay task. So they got to pick out a video about maybe a shark or a seal or different kinds of animals. They could choose tiger, which animal they wanted to learn about. And we said, okay, you can either watch this science video about this animal, or we'll give you 3 stickers. So stickers are like,
currency. Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, my parents, I think when my children were younger, totally inflated the market and gave them like a massive sticker book, right? So I was like, couldn't use stickers as currency for my children. But for most children, this is good currency.
Maybe you needed to pivot to Band-Aids because those are also currency in my house. So
we love Band-Aids. That's right. Yeah. So children will tell you, okay, I'd rather have the 3 stickers than watch the video. And we say, well, what if it was only 2 stickers? Would you still want the stickers or would you want to watch the video? Right. And so we actually get them to calibrate how many stickers are worth the trade for the video. If they say, oh, I still want to watch the video, we say, well, what if it was 4 stickers? What if it was 5 stickers, right? So we get an estimate of sort of the value of the video. So we're literally measuring from a preschooler's perspective, right? What is the value of new scientific information? So that's called a willingness to pay task, but it's a way of measuring curiosity.
That's fascinating.
In children. And so what we found was that children's learning and willingness to pay scores were higher in the condition in which they were encouraged to ask more questions. Some of these effects were marginal, which means they were small effects, but we found that they were strongest. So they worked the most for children that had lower language scores coming in or that might have more challenges with attention coming in. So students that might might struggle with school content, those were the kids for which the question asking intervention really had the biggest impact. For those kids, it really supported them in learning the content and being excited about learning new content. So what this tells us as scientists and as parents and as teachers is rewarding children, getting them to ask questions is a form of engagement that's actually helps their learning and helps their enthusiasm for content. And the hope is that means that in future learning, right, they're that much more engaged, that they're that much more willing to uncover new data. And you can have this sort of rich get richer effect of being excited about something, and that thus you want to ask more questions about it, and thus you're more engaged with it, and so you learn more, and that makes you even more excited about it. And so we're hoping that those kinds of little minimal interventions that we can do with children to encourage them to ask their own questions, that might really support that curiosity and learning. So that's one study that we've done that's sort of looked at from the child asking questions side.
Okay.
And then there's also this parents asking questions side. Did you want to ask something else about the child study?
I have some questions about it.
Great. Good. I love your questions.
Good job. So 2 things. The first is when you're telling me this, but I think I got stuck on this like great question. I love hearing your questions and then, helping them answer it. So are you sure that it's because they're asking more questions that they want to see more science videos? Or is it possible that they liked being affirmed by a caring adult and they saw that behavior of watching science videos and asking questions got warm and fuzzy feelings back? So are they interested in watching those videos because they're thinking they might get a chance to have another interaction like that with a grown-up? And I guess at the end of the day, they're watching it. Does it matter? Like how it's coming about. But I think from a science perspective, you guys must be interested in what's the actual mechanism. Yes, like if you stone-faced them and just answered their question without any warm and fuzzies, would it still have the same outcome?
Thank you so much. So let me say two things about that. The first that I should have been clear about is that we were actually also giving lots of positive reinforcement to the listening kids. So
Oh,
you did a
great.
great job listening. You paid great attention. Good job. So absolutely, we wanted to control for affect, because as you intuit correctly, that's a really big motivator for children, knowing that they have rapport with the person that's teaching them, feeling safe in the context, and feeling positive reinforcement are all really important for learning. So you are 100% correct. So we made sure to control for that aspect. It's an open question. The degree to which, if you pin those things against each other, right? So if you have question asking just for the sake of question asking with no positive reinforcement, do we think that that's still going to be beneficial for children? I think your intuition is right. If I'm not getting positively reinforced, then why would I keep asking questions? Or I might feel bad about generating questions. And in fact, this is something that comes up a lot. I teach a curiosity class to master students, so curiosity and learning and development. And we have a lot of students from other countries. And one of the things that we get a lot, I hear a lot from those students, is their own personal reflections of growing up in other kinds of school systems, where if they asked a question, they were reprimanded. The teacher said, why aren't you prepared? You should know the answer to that. You shouldn't be interrupting our classroom. You shouldn't be asking questions. And it actually, to them, it felt like it really quashed that natural curiosity that they had, and not getting reinforced to ask questions in a positive way really has this very negative outcome. Both they felt like they were still wondering, but they were scared about how to act or how to act on that. So you're missing, as I said, there's these three pieces to being a successful, adaptable person. There's recognizing that you don't know something, the feeling like you thus want to resolve it, and then feeling like you can resolve it, taking the right actions. And so what those kinds of school systems is doing, it's dampening that feeling like you can resolve it, like you can do something. And so that sort of helplessness or lack of empowerment is really, I think, damaging. I think in our own school system in the United States, it's something we see a lot accidentally. So I think that a lot of teachers are trying to do what's best for their students, and they're under-resourced, underpaid. They're being told from administrators, you only have so much time to cover this content. The test is going to evaluate whether or not you're still going to get tenures or promotions. And so the teachers feel like, I've got only so much time. I've got to teach this content for the test. The test is just drill and kill, right?
Yes.
It's just content that has to be memorized. And so they're forced into this situation where if students are asking questions, I'm sure there's this breaking heart torn moment where they say, I love that you're asking that questions, but I really have to get you to understand this thing that you're going to be quizzed on next week, right? You need to memorize this fact. And so our own school system is set up in a natural tension between teaching the broad inquiry skills that promote curiosity and wonder and excitement, with the fact that teachers are being evaluated and under sort of duress, right, to get content across in these rigid, structured, short amounts of time. So just to speak to your point, like our own teachers are probably doing this to some extent, not because they don't value questions, but because the structure that their educational system has been crammed into in the United States system, especially with No Child Left Behind, policies that were established 25 years ago, that's led to this concern that the educational system is actually dampening children's curiosity around content in schools, around feeling like they're empowered to ask their own questions, about showing that they can be independent and show initiative, and the sort of strength and excitement that comes from being able to take your own idea and realize you can find a solution to it. So that is a trade-off that's happening here as well.
Yeah, I totally hear that. And that was actually my second question, was like, you said that you gave each student, each youth that you or kid that you talked to the same amount of time. But I'm sitting here as a parent who, reading a Peppa Pig book can take us 45 minutes or it can take 5, depending on how many questions I allow and how long I have to dedicate towards bedtime, right? And sometimes we're running late and I'm like, we are just reading this book, kind of wanting them to stop asking so many questions. And even just saying that right now breaks my heart, that I would ever stop them from asking questions. Like, I'm going to redo this entirely tonight, do it differently forever now after we've spoken. But I think about that with teachers too. It's like, how can you feel that you're teaching to content or getting enough there for them and teaching them everything they're supposed to learn, quote unquote, while also allowing for what could be endless questions? And you gave some really good redirection recommendations earlier, even around like the dinner time, making dinner example. So I think that there's ways that you can weave that in, but I'm curious how you did that in your own study, knowing that you had, say, 30 minutes for each child, regardless of which group they were in. So did you just only get through a very small part of the content for the question group?
It's interesting. In our experiments, I feel like there wasn't a concern for running out of time. On average, children were asking just a handful of questions per session. It could be because they're interacting with someone they don't know very well. And so they're already testing out the how much should I be asking? How much could I be asking? There's a question of sort of trust. Do I trust you enough to ask you a question? Is it okay to reveal my lack of knowledge right now? And I actually think this actually ties into a topic that we're starting to look at in our own lab about one potential benefit of these large language generative AI models like ChatGPT that might exist. I have lots of moral qualms. I have lots of concerns about these. I think offloading thinking and active learning is something I'm really concerned about. But I think there's at least one thing that I think that is promising with this, and that is that for a lot of students and for a lot of people, asking a question in our society is like reflecting like that you don't know something, that you should know something, right? So instead of celebrating our own uncertainties, we have a habit of being embarrassed about not knowing something. And I think what these kinds of large language models do, like ChatGPT, is they offer a place where people can say, oh, wait, what does LLM mean again? I feel like I'm supposed to know what that means, but I don't. Can I just ask this model? Because the model is endlessly patient. It's not judging you, hopefully anonymous, right? So
it's often really sycophantic, right? It tells you such a good question.
That was great. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. You're so thoughtful for thinking.
So a lot of my work is really centered on the importance of having a human social partner, because the assumptions that we make when we're engaging with other people really helps shape that learning. But this might be one case in which we don't want a human other person feeling like it's on the other side, because that might cause children to sort of withhold or be shy about asking questions. And so in our particular study, there weren't too many questions that were being asked, presumably because children were not really used to this kind of setting. They weren't used to being encouraged to ask questions. We had to sort of tease it out of them. They did ask more questions over the period of the training. So from the first day to the 8th day, we saw a significant uptick in a number of total questions. So they were learning it's okay to ask questions. But I think it's a testament probably to your parenting and your daughter's comfort around you, that she does want to ask you so many questions and feels comfortable doing so. I think, with my own children, I've noticed sometimes they ask more questions at bedtime when they just don't want to go to bed yet. And so it's not clear how much is true wonder and how much is just stretching out that window. But as a parent, I also try to think about it and say, they want to spend time with me, right? They're looking for that attachment and for that opportunity to bond with me. And we still have rules. You still have to go to bed at this time, but I try to look at it from that perspective too. So I do think this intuition you have around the kinds of feedback they're getting about the question is so important. And that might be why we saw differences with our own kids not asking as many in our study as you might see at home.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering. So I want to hear about the grown-ups asking questions.
So grown-ups asking questions is also really great for children's learning. For one thing, just modeling curiosity, modeling that it's okay to ask questions, that provides this idea that it's safe, that this is something I want to do. But there's a kind of question that we've looked at in our lab that we call pedagogical questions. So these are questions asked by a knowledgeable adult with the intention to teach. And children recognize when an adult is asking them a pedagogical question. And when you contrast pedagogical questions to, say, just direct instruction, that's when a parent just tells you the answer. Or you contrast pedagogical questions to something we'd call information-seeking questions. That's when the question that they hear is just asked by someone who's not knowledgeable. You see really big differences in children's play and learning that follows. So, for example,
I'm so curious. Tell me more. What do you see?
So there's been a lot of studies in our lab. So I'll give you a couple quick examples. One is we were teaching children about the idea of psychosomatic effects, that you can be being worried about something might cause a tummy ache, is something that young children, for example, typically don't believe is possible. They've got a really strong belief in domain boundaries. So if something's psychological, it's not going to affect something biological.
I think a lot of grown-ups have that belief too still. Yeah. Despite like neurogastroenterologists existing and having jobs.
We know things like being embarrassed can cause you to blush, right? Or being really angry might cause a headache, or these other kinds of effects. But children do struggle with that, especially in the preschool years. So we gave children a storybook. And for some children, we just asked a pedagogical question as we were reading this training storybook, teaching about the outcomes. So we said, why does Sally blush when she gets embarrassed? It's because her brain sends energy to her heart, and that sends blood to her cheeks, and that makes her cheeks, right? So we go through, but we just either ask this pedagogical question or we didn't. We gave a direct instruction. The reason why Sally cheeks turn red when she's embarrassed. And we found that children learned and remembered the content significantly better when they got a pedagogical question as opposed to just direct instruction. Another example of this is we gave children a novel toy to play with. So we had someone who knew how the toy worked say, I wonder what this button does, versus someone who knew how the toy works saying, you try this button to make the toy work, versus someone who had never seen the toy look over at the toy and say, I wonder what that button does. And so what we found is that children who got this pedagogical question, when the question was asked by a knowledgeable person with the intention to teach, they learned that target function just as well as children who got the direct instruction. So they were able to figure out how that button worked. But they also went on to explore and discover a lot more about the toy than the children who got direct instruction, who just restricted their play to that target function. So pedagogical questions might support not only learning of the content information, but also creating an opportunity for children to go on and to explore more about the toy. And there's a couple other studies that we've done that hint at that. So for example, we've looked at families coming into a zoo setting where we also had a lab set up. And we coded whether or not parents were asking pedagogical questions to their kids or not. And what we found is that for families whose parents asked more pedagogical questions, we then had them play with our novel toy. Those were the kids who explored more and explored the toy more. So that suggests that there's a correlation between growing up with parents who ask pedagogical questions and then being willing to explore more. And there's one more quick study I'm going to talk about, if that's okay.
Please.
And that's the study that's about learning to learn. So we brought parents into the lab and we taught them about a new toy that works either by blocks that are the same color as the machine make the machine go, or blocks that are the same shape as the machine make the machine go. There's different rules for how we picked one of those rules. There's counterbalanced across conditions. So some kids saw some kids saw others. But what we did was we had parents play a game with the children where the parents knew how the machines worked. We said, don't just tell your children, just engage with your children, right? See if you can help them learn about how the machine works. And we coded whether or not the parents were asking pedagogical questions to the children, or whether they were being really directive and just telling the children what to do, or whether they're being completely hands-off and not engaging with the children at all. And then critically, what we did was we said, okay, now that you've done this joint parent-child play, we're going to bring the children back and show them a totally new kind of causal learning. So it's a new kind of machine with a new kind of rule. It's actually the material of the block in the machine have to match rather than the pattern or something like that. And we said, well, we're going to let children play on their own and see if they can figure out the rule. And what we found is that children whose parents asked pedagogical questions, who are engaged in this helping the children think through solving it on their own, those were the children who learned best now in the independent play period.
So they were adaptable. Like they could adapt the way that they learned or figured things out to a entirely new situation.
Exactly. It's like those kids whose parents were asking those kinds of questions were more ready to learn on their own. They were able to discover then when it was their turn to be not scaffolded by their parent. So it implies pedagogical questions are children are sensitive to how they work. By the way, pedagogical questions sound different from information-seeking questions. So the way that we ask them, the tone is different. And even children, if you just hear exactly the same question, can hear the difference. And we'll say, this one's a teaching question, this one's... So there's cues to this as well beyond just are they knowledgeable? But children are sensitive to that, and it supports their sort of learning to learn, as we call it.
And so I think that what I'm learning here is that like well-intentioned adults can jump in too fast. Well, this is how that works. Oh, we just need to finish the Peppa Pig book. Doesn't matter that Peppa's dress is purple in this page and red in the next page. It's just pretend it's different days, whatever. Or maybe kinder version of that. But what is something you wish more grown-ups or caregivers would stop doing when they see kids trying to make sense of something or ask questions, or would start doing, I guess, in these types of interactions with new things?
It's a great question. What I hope is that parents will model wonder and excitement and enthusiasm around their children's questions, will show if they don't know something that they can look it up together, that they can find ways to find the answers together to scaffold. There's a balance between getting your child to learn on their own and never satisfying them with an answer. If you ask a question as a kid and your adult says, well, what do you think? Actually, now you're sort of not reinforcing the question asking behavior, because they're like, well, what's the reward in that, right? So I'm asking for help for a reason, right? So there is a sweet spot there, and we're still trying to understand exactly the different factors that go into balancing that. But I think being able to recognize that you need to get at the level of the child. You have to think about the content that they're excited about, right? What are they asking about? What do they care about? Tune into that and be involved in this quality time together where you're engaging in this collaborative learning. I think those are the things that show the child that they're supported, that foster that curiosity, and that help maintain sort of a love of learning throughout the lifetime.
This was incredibly useful for me tonight. And I think for a lot of the parents that are going to be listening, I'm hearing that we should consider, as parents or caregivers or anybody that is interacting with young children, to model wonder and excitement. And that can come in two forms. That can be genuine wonder and excitement or genuine questions. But the true, like really sneaky, helpful questions are these pedagogical questions. So questions where your intent is to teach them something by asking them to sort it out in their own way. And then also really supporting kids in asking questions, allowing them space to ask questions and as many as they want, and really reinforcing that as a positive interaction with them. So I think that I've taken a lot away from this with my last question of our time together. In 10 years, how do we design schools, technology, parenting norms? I bought 1,000 books and listened to 1 million podcasts that honor the way that you and your team are finding out that kids actually think and learn and develop really helpful curiosity skills. What should we do from a design perspective to build the best outcomes?
That's a great question. I don't have a ton of experience in school design, and there's always a question of what's happening at the policy level. But I think a lot of people have the right intuition around inquiry-based learning, the idea that allowing children to have some choice in their interests and choosing topics around that, so that they're engaging with their curiosity when they're solving problems is something that's really important. Allowing more space and time for rewarding questions. I know of teachers that have, circle time at the mats at the beginning of the day and say, okay, if you guys can ask me one question that I don't know the answer to, then you get 1 point. If you can ask me a question that Google doesn't know the answer to, you get 2 points, right? And getting them to think through, like, what are interesting questions, right, to ask. I think that that's something we can do. And as parents, just keeping in mind that, our children are looking up to us. And so modeling that love of learning, that enthusiasm for discovering new things, for revising your beliefs, that it's a great opportunity when we're wrong, because that means that there's something to be learned, I think is really important. And the kinds of questions that we ask our children are important too, not just when we're modeling them pedagogically, but even asking what I'd call wonder questions. So how does that work? Why does it work that way? As opposed to sort of yes, no questions, right? Mm-hmm. Like, did you have lunch today at school? What about lunch did you really like today, right? And letting children sort of engage in this open-ended back and forth conversation with you. So I hope that we see some changes there. I hope we see changes in parenting practice and expectations around letting our children go a little freer. less helicoptering, so that they form that independence about discovering things a little more with that scaffolding on their own. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Well, I think if we were to stick to these things, in 10 years, our kids will look a lot different than maybe some kids right now do. And I definitely am going to take away a lot of insight from our conversation today. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise and findings with everybody who listens.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for your great questions and for your own wonder and excitement.
I'm definitely encouraged to ask more now. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Dr. Bonawitz, thank you so much for joining us today. Your work reminds me that my kids' thinking isn't something just to simplify or kind of rush past. It's something to nurture, respect, and learn from. To our listeners, if this episode gave you a new way of thinking about how kids learn, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with somebody who cares about childhood and education. See you next time.